And this is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Peter Campbell leaned in closer, urging Stephen Lacey to continue. As Lacey explained how easy it would be to escape, Campbell allowed himself to imagine life as a free man again. Campbell had only been at the convict establishment in Western Australia for a couple of months, but he was facing a life sentence. He had already spent close to 2 years serving his time in an English prison and in the hold of the Edwin Fox, which had transported him there in November 1858. Lacey was a young man in his 20s, incarcerated for various offences since he was 14 years old. He had arrived on the Phoebe Dunbar in 1853 and had become very familiar with the routine and workings of the convict barracks. He made it all sound so easy, telling Campbell of his sailing skills that would be crucial for getting them as far away from Australia as possible. Campbell too had extensive sailing experience. He had risen through the ranks to become a second mate on an American trading ship called the James L. Bogart. It was on board this ship that Campbell had shot a man during a near riot, leading to his sentence for wounding with intent. Campbell ran his hand through his brown hair as he considered Lacey's plan. So much could go wrong. He glanced around at the convict establishment with its imposing walls and cramped cells. He thought about the tasteless gruel and the back-breaking labour he would have to endure for the best years of his life, and his family he would never see again. He had nothing to lose. As they made plans for their escape, Lacey convinced 3 other convict men to join them. Henry Stevens, who had arrived the previous year and was serving out a 14-year sentence. John Haynes, a man serving life for wounding with intent. And John Williams, a blacksmith with a 20-year sentence. Most days, the convicts were sent to work outside the formidable walls of the convict establishment beneath the beating sun. The 5 men were labouring in different work parties, each needing to come up with their own plan for slipping away undetected. They knew that the success of their plan depended on waiting for the right moment, when the guards would be too busy, too distracted, or too complacent to notice a few men slipping away into the thick bush. On Tuesday, the 25th of January, 1859, the air was thick with anticipation as they shuffled alongside the rest of their fellow convicts. The weight of the day pressed down on them, but beneath the surface there was a quiet excitement. The hours passed, and each man kept a vigilant watch on the movements of their overseers. With about an hour left in their working day, all 5 men managed to slip away undetected and met up in the surrounding bush. The men pressed through the brush as quickly as they could, trying to stay out of sight. They knew that in an hour's time the convict workers would be called to muster, and their absence would be discovered if it hadn't been already. This small window was all they had to get a head start. When they came to the river, they waded in. The cool water against their skin was a welcome relief. They wasted no time edging around the bend to Point Walter, where they discovered a small boat. Inside the gig were 4 oars. They climbed in and began rowing, pushing themselves hard, determined to get downstream as quickly as they could. As they did, a fisherman glanced at them curiously. The prisoners exchanged looks, but spoke very little, adrenaline pulsating through their bodies, acutely aware that every passing minute was crucial for their head start. Meanwhile, back at the work gangs, at the close of the day, the overseers began to call the muster. It wasn't long before they discovered the men missing, and soon sent a dispatch to Perth. With darkness beginning to fall, they realised that there was little point pursuing the men that night. At first light, the land police followed their tracks and found the boat missing, surmising that the prisoners had probably made it to one of the islands. However, the police were unable to conduct an extensive search as Governor Kennedy had them employed on his visit to Rottnest Island that day. Despite receiving the news about the escapees, when he reached Fremantle, the governor continued his plans to be escorted to the island using the water police boat. This decision was later heavily criticised in the press. Believing that the police were hot on their heels, Campbell and his crew furiously rowed towards Garden Island. The gig, already in poor shape, creaked under the strain. Campbell called on Lacey to assist, but it soon became apparent that Lacey's extensive sailing skills had been nothing but a lie. He floundered under pressure and was unable to follow basic sailing terms. The men watched on in disbelief as he struggled, their confidence quickly turning to impending doom, the tension shifting from fear to anger, directed squarely at Lacey. When they finally reached the long, narrow island, they pulled in, dragging the dinghy up on the sandy shore. Campbell collapsed in a heap on the sand, exhausted from trying to work the broken scull throughout the night. The other men left him to recover and kept a lookout as they made their way to the house of James Reed and his family. It was around 3 p.m. when the 4 desperate escapees stumbled upon James Reed and his tenant, John Grant, working outside. The 2 men were no match for the prisoners and were quickly overpowered. In an instant, their arms were bound tightly behind their backs with rope. Yanking them roughly by the arms, the prisoners steered them towards the house and ordered them to sit down. Reed sat anxiously on the couch as Williams and Lacey searched the house. Reed's wife, Ruth, was making her bed when the 2 men burst into the room. Startled, she asked, quote, "What's the matter?" End quote. William responded, quote, "Go in, or your brain shall come out." End quote. Terrified, she ran to the sitting room and rushed to her husband's side. Helping themselves to beer, the prisoners instructed Reed's boy to fetch them more to drink and something to eat. With trembling hands, the boy prepared a meal of bread, butter, eggs, and tea as the prisoners ransacked the place. Campbell made it to the house and took over watch of Reed, his wife, and Grant. He took pity on the men and untied their ropes, but showed them that he had their pistol. Reed watched on as they took some of his clothing and supplies such as bread, tea, sugar, flour, butter, and raisins. Later, he heard the clinking of his wife's sovereigns coming from the other room. Williams approached Reed and said, quote, "Now, old man, I will give you 1 more minute. I know there is more money, and I'll have it or your life." End quote. The tension in the room thickened. Reed pleaded, but Campbell interjected, saying that they had no time to lose as they needed to get away. It was around 1 a.m. when the men gathered up Reed's possessions, including 6 old muskets, 1 sword, 3 pistols, and a brass swivel, and began taking turns carrying it to the beach and loading them into Reed's whaleboat. Just as they were about to leave, Williams paused, turned to face Reed. His eyes were cold, his voice a low threat that carried in the still night air. He told him that if he left the house before 1 hour had passed, he would have his brains at his feet. With that chilling promise hanging between them, the prisoners sprinted back toward the water. They leapt into Reed's whaleboat, and without another word, they pushed off into the dark expanse of the river, the boat slipping silently into the night. The boat, heavy with Reed's possessions, crept quietly up the coast, its occupants barely speaking as they manoeuvred through the dark waters. When they reached the mouth of the Irwin, the sun was just beginning to rise. Exhausted, their bodies stiff from the long journey, Campbell guided them into shore. Hauling the boat onto land, their legs wobbled as they made their way to the nearest house. At that very moment, Mr. John Speedy, a farmhand employed by Mr. Edward Downes, was heading toward the barn to begin his morning chores. The quiet of the morning was shattered when the ragged prisoners suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Stephen shoved a loaded gun up to the startled man's face and barked at him to lie down or he would blow his brains out. Shaking, Mr. Speedy slowly sunk to the cold, dusty ground, his heart racing. Stevens towered over him, the gun digging deeper into his chest. Campbell, Haynes, Williams and Lacey burst through the door of the house to find Mr. Downes standing alone. The moment he saw the muskets in their hands, his face drained of colour. Without a second thought, his hand shot up in surrender, his body tensed with fear. The men didn't waste any time. Williams roughly grabbed his arm, spun him around and tied both arms behind his back. Once Mr. Downes was secured, he pushed him into the corner of the room where they could keep an eye on him. Moments later, Mr. Speedy was ushered into the house, his face pale and filled with dread. They tied Mr. Speedy's arms behind his back and unceremoniously pushed him toward the corner to join his employer. Both men now huddled together, their fates now in the hands of their captors. At the far end of the house, Mrs. Downes stirred in her bed, her sleep disrupted by the commotion. As the realization of what was happening sank in, the door to her bedroom flung open. A scream tore from her throat as she instinctively grabbed the bed sheets, pulling them tightly to her chest. Her breath quickened, heart hammering in her chest as one of the men approached, a leering smile spreading across his face. His eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger as he slowly climbed onto the bed. The malicious look in his eyes sent a bone-chilling shiver down her spine, and in that moment she had never felt so utterly terrified. At the sound of her scream, Campbell came running into the room, demanding that the prisoner get off her. Refusing, he continued towards her until the other prisoners barked at him to do as Campbell said or they would leave him behind. Reluctantly, he crawled off the bed, casting one last lingering glance at Mrs. Downes. Campbell commanded the men to quickly grab some sacks and start filling them with anything they may need. The prisoners sprung into action. The cupboard doors were flung open as they scrambled to grab bread, chunks of cheese, slabs of butter and salted pork. When they moved to the drawers, Campbell untied Mr. Speedy and ordered him to bring a horse to the house. They hastily loaded the horse up with the sacks, instructing Mr. Speedy to guide the horse down to the beach. When they reached the shore, Stevens and Haynes looked the quivering Mr. Speedy over and demand his clothing, hat, belt, and the small pocket knife he has in his pocket. Campbell, Lacey and Williams joined them, carrying Mr. Downes' double-barreled gun and pistol. They loaded the whaleboat and hurriedly pushed it off the bank, jumped in and vanished into the early morning mist. The men were blessed with favourable winds. allowing them to hug the coastline with ease. As restlessness began to settle in, Campbell steered them toward the shore. They stumbled onto the beach, their feet sinking into the soft sand as they searched for fresh water to quench their thirst. Suddenly, an unsuspecting settler emerged from the trees and asked where they were from. Without hesitation, as if rehearsed for this very moment, they answered that they belonged to the Jane, that had been wrecked down south. Before the man could press them further, they wasted no time, slipping back into their boat and pushing off into the bay. The men pressed on, making their way up the coast, stopping at various points along the way to regroup and gather what little supplies they could. Meanwhile, Mr. Speedy, determined to alert the authorities, made his way straight to Champion Bay. Upon arrival, he swiftly informed the police about the events that had unfolded at Mr. Downs' place. Sergeant Walsh, with his team in tow, immediately set out for Port Gregory, their pace quickened by the urgency of the situation. They arrived just in time to watch the prisoners approach the shore. Tension hung in the air as they prepared to intercept the fugitives. But fate had a different plan. From the edge of the community, a local, oblivious to the tense circumstances unfolding, raised his gun and took aim at a flock of seagulls circling overhead. The sharp crack of the shot echoed through the air. The prisoners, startled by the sound, misinterpreted the shot as an attack. Panic surged through them, and in a frenzy they bolted back toward the boat, their hearts pounding. They pushed off into the water with frantic urgency. Sergeant Walsh and his team stood frozen, just moments too late. The opportunity had slipped through their fingers, the prisoners now vanishing into the distance. The wind howled, picking up strength with each passing moment, as dark grey storm clouds gathered ominously above. The growing swell tossed the convicts about roughly as they sailed further north. They were nearing Dirk Hartog's island, and hopes were high that calmer seas awaited them. Meanwhile, the police stayed put, waiting for assistance. They lacked a boat that could handle such conditions. Once a schooner had arrived, they gave chase. The following day, as they worked their way around the point, the boat surged forward, struck another boat, and with a deafening crack, the vessel split in two, sending debris and men alike into the water. The convicts continued up north, though their progress was slow, when they spotted the Preston charging straight toward them. Panic raced through the men. They knew they stood no chance against this sleek, powerful vessel. Escape by sea was impossible. In desperation, they veered toward the shore, hoping to outrun their pursuers on land. Though still 200 or 300 yards away, the police were quick to react. The crack of gunfire rang out, the bullets whizzing past the convicts by mere inches. The men didn't hesitate. With adrenaline pumping, they bolted into the bush, disappearing into the thick undergrowth like shadows. The police made landfall soon after, seizing the convicts' boat, and then sent a party to search for the men in the wilderness. But they turned up nothing. The convicts had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The convicts were very low on food and water and had lost a considerable amount of weight. They felt weak. Every movement was an exhausting effort. Their skin, scorched by the relentless sun, was red and raw, a constant reminder of the days spent without shelter or respite. They had travelled a staggering 900 kilometres or more from the convict establishment to Shark Bay. Tensions were at an all-time high. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear festered beneath the surface, and it was Lacey who bore the brunt of the men's anger. He had become a liability. His incompetence had cost them precious supplies. He was caught helping himself to water after it had been rationed out. To make matters worse, he pulled the plug out of the keg, letting the precious water go to waste. The men's patience had worn thin, and now they were ready to turn on him. The men trudged through the dense bush, moving northward, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and the police. Finding an abandoned hut, the convicts hunkered down for the evening. The following morning, hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. The 5 men set off, determined to forage for whatever they could find to sustain them. They followed the rocks around the shoreline, scouring for oysters and crabs. Campbell fashioned a fishing line using a rusty pair of scissors for a hook and a tattered handkerchief for a line. When Campbell returned to the hut, he caught Lacey helping himself to the last of the sugar. The rush of anger was instant and overwhelming. Without thinking, Campbell charged at Lacey, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. Lacey immediately dropped to the floor, cowering under the wrath that was about to descend upon him. Campbell delivered a powerful kick to the head, sending Lacey back onto the sand. Exhausted from the exertion, Campbell laid down too, letting his anger subside. Slowly, silently, Lacey got to his feet and wandered away from camp. He did not return for several days. Campbell looked around at his fellow escapees, who were all lying on the floor of the hut, taking shelter from the searing heat, too tired to speak. He knew that they needed to keep trying to find food, or they would most certainly die of starvation. He could feel his own body slowly shutting down. He raised himself off the floor with great effort and tried to rally his friends. Every movement was a struggle, but their dire situation pushed him to get up and find food. He convinced Williams and Stevens to go fishing with him, leaving Haynes and Lacey. They returned to the hut at sundown, triumphantly carrying their catch of fish. As they approached, Campbell could hear Lacey crying and moaning. He found Haynes outside, warming himself by the fire, and Lacey lying on the ground about 4 yards away, clutching his stomach and writhing in pain. When he asked what had happened, Haynes gestured towards the gun with the buckshot, leaning up against the wall of the hut, and said casually, quote, "I have given him a dose of it in the belly," end quote. Not believing that he would have shot Lacey, he continued on his way to the hut. Desperate for a drink of water, Williams went in search of the tin. When Williams learned that Lacey had carelessly left the tin about 100 yards away, he exploded, saying, quote, "You wretch, you have been trouble enough to us. It was you that brought us here," end quote. Lacey whimpered that he would try and do better, got to his feet, still clutching his stomach. As he turned to go and fetch the tin, Williams struck Lacey over the back of the head with the flat of his cutlass, then delivered several blows with his fist to Lacey's chest. Crying, Lacey scampered off in the direction of the tin. When Lacey returned to camp, the smell of the fish roasting on the open fire made his mouth water. He gingerly handed the tin to Williams, his movements cautious, hoping for a warmer reception. But Williams, eyes narrowed and voice cold, snapped at him to leave the camp. Haynes, standing nearby, echoed the sentiment, his tone equally dismissive. Lacey begged them to let him stay, pleading that he had nowhere to go, his words raw with fear. But Williams and Haynes were unmoved and insisted. In a last-ditch attempt, Lacey's voice quivered as he muttered, quote, "My life will be on your hands," end quote. A haunting admission that without help he would surely starve to death. Feeling sorry for Lacey, Stephen said, quote, "If you won't have the man here, give him a brand and let him make a fire for himself." End quote. The tension in the camp was thick. Williams and Haynes wanted him gone, and Campbell and Stevens felt Lacey should stay. Lacey slunk away from the camp, but 20 minutes later he returned. Williams grabbed the double-barreled gun and ran at Lacey, exclaiming, quote, "Get out of this, you wretch!" End quote. He struck Lacey hard on the left side of his neck, breaking the stock of the gun. Lacey crumpled, dazed. Without pause, Williams and Haynes seized him by the arms and dragged him around to the back of the hut, dumping him there. Moments later, Williams returned, saying, quote, "He won't trouble us tonight." End quote. The following morning, Campbell stirred from sleep to the sound of bubbling water. Williams stood over the fire, stirring a pot. He was boiling salt water and flour into a thin, grey gruel, barely edible, but it was something. Campbell, still groggy, asked him if he was making anything for Lacey. Williams didn't look up. "No," he said flatly. Campbell said nothing more and ate some of his share, then added more water to the remaining mixture to stretch the meal. Carrying the thin broth, he made his way around the side of the hut. What he found made his chest tighten. Lacey lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and sunburnt, lips cracked, eyes barely open. His body looked smaller somehow, shrunken by hunger, heat, and hopelessness. Campbell knelt beside him and asked gently if he wanted a drink. Lacey didn't speak. He only managed a faint nod. Cradling Lacey's head in one hand, Campbell lifted the tin to his lips and slowly poured the watery gruel into his mouth. Some of it spilled, trickling down the sides of his face, but Lacey swallowed what he could. Campbell spent the day by the shoreline, trying to catch fish with his makeshift fishing line and prizing oyster shells off the rocks. When the sun began to sink and the sky turned a pale orange, he headed back to camp. Williams was absently poking at the fire. Campbell asked him if he had checked on Lacey lately. Without looking up, he gruffly replied that he hadn't, nor would he. Campbell stared at him for a moment, then nodded grimly. Haynes, who had been silently listening, stood. Without a word, he followed Campbell around the back of the hut. There, lying just as he had left him, was Lacey. His body was curled in a ball. Campbell crouched beside him, his stomach sinking. He didn't need to touch him to confirm what he already knew. Lacey was dead. When Williams was told, his hardened expression faltered for the first time. His brows drew together and his voice came out low, almost disbelieving, quote, "Had not thought he was so far gone." End quote. The 4 remaining men lifted the body carefully and carried it about 100 yards from the hut toward a hole they had begun digging for a well. It would now serve another purpose. There was no ceremony, no words spoken, just the grim, practical task of burial. Before they laid him in the earth, they began stripping Lacey of his clothes, taking anything that might help them survive. A shirt, a boot, a threadbare piece of cloth. Every scrap mattered now. As Williams pulled back the flap of Lacey's flannel shirt, he revealed Lacey's abdomen. There was a small, round hole, no bigger than a fingertip. The skin surrounding it was a mottled mess of bruising, deep purples and sickly blues. A gunshot wound. Campbell stepped back, his breath catching in his throat, eyes wide. It had been real. Williams had shot him. Williams saw the look on his face, shock, maybe even a flicker of accusation, and quickly pulled the shirt back over the wound. No one said anything. The truth hung heavily between them. When they returned to camp, the tension was thick. The men moved mechanically, slipping into the routines that gave shape to their days, plucking bitter berries from the scrub, casting lines into the water, prizing oyster shells from rocks, and tending the fire. Few words passed between them. Above the camp, thin tendrils of smoke curled lazily into the pale sky, an unintentional signal. Out on the water, the police boat caught sight of the dark ribbon of smoke and headed straight for them. By the time the boat grounded on the sand, the convicts offered no resistance, starvation and unrelenting thirst winning out. When asked where Lacey was, they told the police that he had died of starvation and dysentery. The convicts were taken back to Fremantle and kept in the holding cells to await trial. Days dragged by as the authorities picked apart their account of Lacey's death. The men's stories held mostly true, but not entirely. Subtle differences surfaced. A time, a word, a gesture remembered differently. Enough to raise suspicion. For weeks Campbell held the line, but the burden of the lie grew heavier than he could bear. One morning he broke. He took the police to the shallow grave where Lacey was buried. Lacey's remains were still mostly intact. An autopsy was conducted, which aligned with Campbell's story. On the 5th and 6th of July, Campbell, Stevens, Haynes and Williams appeared before Judge Alfred McFarland and a bench of magistrates in the Court of General Quarter Sessions. Campbell received a conditional pardon as he had turned Queen's evidence against the other men. Stevens' sentence was increased. Both Williams and Haynes were sentenced to 9 months solitary confinement, and Williams was also convicted of the murder of Lacey. It is said that Campbell quietly left Western Australia not long after, slipping away without farewell or fanfare. Some believed he feared retribution from the convict ranks, those who saw his confession not as courage but betrayal. In the eyes of many, he had broken an unspoken code. Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.